probably the most dangerous chapter. He was thrown off his horse, divine providence and mighty hand of God protecting him. Hi friends, hope you're having a wonderful and purposeful day. Welcome to my first video in the series on the life of John Newton, the famous author of the world's most popular hymn, Amazing Grace. The once vile, blasphemous seaman that was transformed by the immeasurable power of God. The notorious slave trader turned Anglican minister that eventually summoned the courage to act on his godly convictions and became a voice in the abolitionist movement against the slave trade. Wow, the works of God are great indeed. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get started. In this episode, let us look at his early life. John Newton was born in London on July 25, 1725, to John Newton Sr. and Miss Elizabeth Newton. His father was a commander in the Mediterranean trade and was away at sea most of the time. His mother was a devout woman who often prayed for Newton with tears and brought him up in the nurture of God's word from a very early age. She was a member at the old gravel lane dissenting chapel, and she knew her scriptures very well. On a side note, dissenters or Protestant Christians who did not conform to the customs and practices of the Church of England at that time. Elizabeth made little Newton memorize scriptures that stayed deep down in his heart, though he might not have been old enough to understand it. Her prayers and wish for Newton was that he would serve God. Newton was later told that from the time of his birth, his mother's desire was that he would become a minister of religion. She had made plans for him to be educated at St. Andrews in Scotland, which happened to be a Calvinist school. The scripture she taught Newton, coupled with the heavy dose of love for a young maiden named Polly, rescued him later on in life when he sold himself to the depravity of the world and was contemplating ending his life on more than one occasion. Little Newton did not enjoy the noisy games of the neighborhood children. He loved the company of his mother and was always willing to learn what she taught him. Elizabeth paid very careful attention to Newton's education, and under her instruction, he was able to read any common English book by the time he turned 4. He was also well versed in the first principles and rules of arithmetic. That's right, he was a smart cookie. In fact, at the age of 6, he began lessons in Latin. Now there was another important influence in John Newton's early life, Dr. Jennings. He was the pastor at the old gravel lane chapel. Newton enjoyed his preaching and was deeply influenced by many of his sermons. Dr. Jennings, who was a neighbor to the Newtons, made great efforts to counsel and shepherd them on a regular basis. Under the great influence of his mother and Dr. Jennings, Newton was making good progress and growing in his spiritual knowledge. Unfortunately, this rapid progress was cut short when his godly mother finished her earthly journey just 2 weeks before John Newton's 7th birthday. Elizabeth Newton was a frail woman who suffered from consumption, the disease more commonly known today as tuberculosis. By the spring of 1732, she was already developing symptoms of advanced consumption. It was believed back then that deep breathing of sea air could help with consumption, and so she decided to move into the family home of her cousin, Elizabeth Catlett, in Chatham on the Kent coast. This wasn't of much help to her, for after a brief struggle, she went to be with the Lord on July 11th of 1732. Newton did not accompany his mother when she moved to Chatham. In fact, he stayed with a family that worshipped at Dr. Jennings' chapel, and he did not get to be with his mother during her last days. Just imagine how distraught Newton must have been under these circumstances. The death of his mother was just the first of many twists in his earthly adventure. His father was at sea when his mother passed away. The following year, when he returned to land, Newton Sr. did not spend much time grieving the loss of his wife. He quickly remarried, the daughter of a wealthy grazier, from his ex. His new wife, Thomasina, who was of Italian descent, gave Newton Sr. 2 sons and a daughter. Though John Newton was not mistreated in his new family, he was relegated to the unfortunate status of the forgotten stepson. His relationship with his father was formal and distant, and this did not change after his mother's death. Newton Sr. never developed the emotional bond that his sons so deeply longed for. But why was that? Was Newton Sr. a bad parent? A heartless man who paid no attention to his young son's needs? Jonathan Aitken, in his biography, John Newton from Disgrace to Amazing Grace, suggests that it had probably to do with his upbringing. He was educated by Spanish Jesuits, the renowned religious order of the Catholic Church. Discipline was heavily emphasized, and this influenced his interaction with people. However, this veneer of coldness must not be confused for apathy. As we will see later on, he was deeply concerned about his son's future and went to great lengths to establish him in the seafaring trade. Nevertheless, his son, who previously was under the watchful eye of his loving mother, now mingled with unruly children and began to learn their ways. John Newton was eventually sent to a boarding school at the age of 8. The gap between father and son widened even further. The advantage he gained from this education was minimal, as it lasted only 2 years. And this was officially the end of Newton's formal education. This is when he began a whole new chapter in his life, probably the most dangerous chapter. At the age of 11, his father, an established and respected ship captain, took him to sea, seeking to introduce him to the business. Newton had visited a few of his father's ships when they were in port. He was familiar with the marine environment, having grown up in Wapping on the banks of the River Thames. He finally made his maiden voyage along with his father to Spain in the year 1736. This was the first of 5 voyages they would make together between 1736 and 1742. While the relationship with his father did not change, Newton got a good grasp of seamanship under the watchful eyes of his father. This training served to be the foundation on which he built his first career. When he was 15, his father's influence helped him secure a job with the merchant in Alicante in Spain. However, his growing impatience and inappropriate behavior brought an end to that endeavor. It is important to note that Newton had changed considerably. He was a rebellious young man in crisis. He had traded the prayers and hymns that his mother taught him for blasphemy and curses. He had not yet given up on all Christian practices taught to him by his mother, but they were insincere, as his heart was set on the things of the world. In many ways, he tried to balance his evil ways with religious effort. However, there are a few occasions when he did recognize the hand of God. On the first occasion, he was thrown off his horse while riding in the countryside. He got up unhurt, but on further inspection, he noticed that he had narrowly missed falling on a spike protruding from a hedgerow. He immediately thanked God for his protection. On another occasion, Newton and his friend had planned to visit a man of war. That's what battleships were called in those days. Newton was late to the appointment and missed catching the long boat that would take them on board. He was furious with himself. However, the long boat hit an underwater obstacle and was capsized. He watched in horror as all the occupants, including his friend, drowned before his eyes. He couldn't help but recognize divine providence and mighty hand of God protecting him. Newton Sr. recognized his son's declining morals and was not pleased to send him to sea. Using his influence, he was able to secure a job for his son in Jamaica. Newton was to be trained in overseeing a slave plantation owned by his father's friend Joseph Manistee. He would then become a planter himself. He happily agreed to the offer as it guaranteed a comfortable future. Preparations were made and he was all set to travel to Jamaica. A few days before his departure to Jamaica, Newton received a letter from his mother's cousin, Elizabeth Catlett, the owner of the house where his mother died. The relationship between the Catletts and the Newtons had turned sour after Elizabeth Newton's death. The Catletts were unhappy with Newton Sr.'s hasty remarriage after his wife's death. The letter was addressed to John Newton, inviting him to visit their family home in Chatham. Newton was indifferent to the invitation. He had no real desire to visit the Catletts. However, just few days before he was to travel to Jamaica, while on a business trip to Kent, Newton found himself within a mile of the Catletts' home. Having his father's permission, he decided to pay them a visit. He knocked, and the doors opened to the most beautiful girl that captured Newton's heart and altered his future forever. Her name was Mary Catlett, better known as Polly. That instant affection Newton had for Polly never subsided. God used Newton's affection for Polly to keep him afloat in the darkest hours of his life. What happened thereafter? Did Newton confess his irresistible feelings to Polly? Did they get married and sail to Jamaica into the sunset? Stay tuned to find out in the next episode. Let us think about the impact and influence we have on the lives of those around us. Are we pouring out ourselves like Elizabeth Newton and Dr. Jennings? Or, like Newton Sr., are we allowing something in our past or present to hold us back? What steps can we take to allow God to work in and through us that we may be blessed and also be a blessing to those around us? I hope you guys enjoyed this episode on Newton's life. Please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might enjoy it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.